In every world where power exists, there is a quiet cost that follows it. Not the cost spoken of in battles or measured in destruction, but a softer, heavier burden that settles in the mind. To be the strongest is not simply to win fights. It is to stand apart, to live at a distance from others, and to carry expectations that no one else can truly share. In anime, this burden is often wrapped in spectacle and myth. But beneath the flashing techniques and legendary names lies a familiar loneliness, one that echoes across very different worlds and characters. This story begins not with conflict, but with separation. The moment someone becomes undeniably strong, the world subtly rearranges itself around them. Allies begin to rely instead of relate. Enemies fear instead of understand. And slowly, without ceremony, the strongest finds themselves alone at the summit, looking down at a world that no longer feels like home. In Jujutsu Kaisen, Satoru Gojo stands as a perfect embodiment of this truth. From the moment he is introduced, he is framed not as a man among others, but as a force of nature. His presence bends the rules of the world. Curses recoil, sorcerers defer. Even his enemies plan entire lifetimes around the single problem of how to seal him away rather than defeat him. Strength, in Gojo's case, is not merely an advantage. It is an identity imposed upon him by everyone else. Gojo smiles often. He jokes, teases, and treats life as though it were a game already won. Yet this playful surface masks something more distant. He does not walk beside others. He hovers above them. His students admire him, but they cannot meet him on equal footing. His peers respect him, but none can truly challenge him. And so, Gojo exists in a strange, in-between state, surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone. This loneliness is not born from rejection, but from inevitability. When you are the strongest, connection becomes fragile. To connect fully is to risk loss. To rely on others is to accept vulnerability. Gojo understands this deeply, even if he rarely speaks it aloud. His desire to raise stronger students is not only an act of mentorship, but a quiet hope that one day someone might stand beside him rather than beneath him. Long before Gojo, another figure stood at a similar peak, though in a far harsher world. Madara Uchiha from Naruto did not simply become strong. He was forged by loss, and betrayal into something terrifyingly absolute. Where Gojo smiles, Madara reflects. Where Gojo jokes, Madara remembers. Yet both share the same fate: isolation brought about by unmatched power. Madara's story begins with companionship. A childhood friendship with Hashirama Senju once promised balance, rivalry, and shared dreams. But as Madara's power grew, so too did his distance from others. The world began to fear him. His own clan doubted him, and the bond that once anchored him slowly eroded under the weight of destiny and conflict. Unlike Gojo, Madara did not try to bridge the gap. He embraced it. He chose solitude over compromise, control over connection. Yet this choice did not free him from loneliness. It deepened it. Madara's vision for the world, a dream of peace enforced through illusion, was ultimately the dream of someone who could no longer believe in genuine bonds. Power had taught him that equality was an illusion, and trust a weakness punished by reality. The burden of being the strongest often reveals itself not in moments of triumph, but in moments of silence. After the battle is over, after the enemy falls, after the world is saved, yet nothing truly changes for the one who saved it. This is where anime lingers, quietly and intentionally, allowing us to see the cost beneath the glory. In One Punch Man, Saitama represents this idea stripped to its barest form. He is so strong that the concept of struggle itself has been erased from his life. Battles end in a single punch. Threats dissolve instantly. And with them, meaning seems to vanish as well. Saitama does not suffer from fear or expectation in the way others do, but from emptiness. His loneliness is quieter, almost mundane, yet no less profound. Where Madara is burdened by history and Gojo by responsibility, Saitama is burdened by boredom. His strength has isolated him from excitement, from growth, and from the simple joy of effort. Others chase power to feel alive. Saitama has power and feels nothing at all. His loneliness is not tragic in presentation, but existential in nature, a reminder that meaning often comes not from winning, but from the struggle itself. Across these stories, a pattern begins to form. Strength separates. It reshapes identity. It changes how the world looks at someone, and eventually, how they look at themselves. The strongest are rarely allowed to simply be human. They become symbols, weapons, last resorts, or gods. And in becoming these things, they lose something quieter, something fragile, something irreplaceable. As this journey continues, we will move deeper into the lives of those who carry this burden. We will explore characters who embraced their strength, those who rejected it, and those who were crushed beneath it. From Aizen's cold transcendence to Escanor's fleeting moments of pride, from silent kings to reluctant protectors, each story reflects a different answer to the same unspoken question. What does it truly mean to be the strongest when no one can stand beside you? For now, the world grows quiet. The battles fade into memory. And at the summit of power, a single figure stands alone, not in victory, but in reflection, waiting for something the strongest rarely find: understanding. In the quiet that follows the idea of absolute strength, it becomes easier to notice a strange pattern shared by those who stand at the very top. Power does not arrive all at once. It accumulates slowly, often unnoticed at first, until one day the world begins to respond differently. Conversations change. Expectations grow heavier. Enemies become more desperate, and allies more distant. For the strongest, this transition is rarely celebrated in peace. It is felt as a gradual separation from everyone else. In many anime worlds, strength is treated as a blessing, something to aspire toward with passion and urgency. Yet for those who actually reach the summit, strength becomes something quieter and heavier. It becomes responsibility without rest. It becomes isolation disguised as admiration. And it becomes a silent contract with the world. As long as you remain the strongest, you will never truly be free. Satoru Gojo is often introduced with laughter and confidence, a man who treats overwhelming power as if it were a casual accessory. His blindfold, his relaxed posture, his playful tone all suggest that being the strongest is effortless. But beneath that surface lies a deeper truth. Gojo's strength did not liberate him from the world of jujutsu sorcerers. It chained him to it. From the moment his power manifested, the balance of the world shifted. Curses grew more cunning. Enemies planned not around victory, but around containment. The existence of one overwhelmingly strong individual forced the world to adapt in fear. Gojo became less a man and more a stabilizing force, a living pillar holding chaos at bay. And a pillar does not move. Gojo's students see him as a protector, a teacher who will always arrive in time. But this expectation is precisely where the burden begins. When one person is strong enough to solve everything, others are never allowed to fail. The world does not permit the strongest to be absent, exhausted, or uncertain. Gojo's casual demeanor masks the truth that he must always be present, always ready, always invincible. Even moments of rest become performative. His humor is not just personality. It is armor. A way to exist among weaker allies without reminding them of the vast, unbridgeable distance between their lives and his own. Because if he were ever to speak honestly, if he were to admit the loneliness of his position, few could truly understand. This pattern repeats across worlds and stories. Madara Uchiha's strength was not born from talent alone, but from an era soaked in war. In his youth, power was survival. To be strong was to live long enough to see the next sunrise. But as Madara's strength grew beyond everyone around him, survival ceased to be the goal. Control became the only remaining challenge. Madara lived in a world where trust was fragile and fleeting. His power made him indispensable, but also feared. Even allies viewed him as a weapon rather than a companion. In such a world, strength does not inspire connection. It erodes it. One of Madara's most defining moments is not a battle, but a realization. Peace cannot be achieved by equalizing power, because power will always create imbalance. His conclusion is chilling in its calmness. If the world cannot coexist under shared weakness, then perhaps it must be subdued under absolute strength. This belief does not come from cruelty. It comes from exhaustion. Madara had seen generations rise and fall. He had fought battles so often that conflict became background noise to his existence. When you are strong enough to win every war, war itself loses meaning. What remains is the question of why the world insists on repeating the same suffering. And so, Madara's strength transformed into ideology. The burden of being the strongest was no longer just physical. It became philosophical. He carried the weight of deciding the fate of the world, because no one else could. In contrast, Saitama's strength exists in a world that almost refuses to acknowledge it. He achieved absolute power, not through destiny or lineage, but through mundane repetition. 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups. A simple routine performed daily, without witnesses or celebration. And yet, Saitama's burden may be the most subtle of all. His strength is so absolute that it has erased struggle from his life. Battles end in a single punch. Threats dissolve before they can register as danger. Victory arrives before excitement can form. The emotional arc that defines heroes simply does not exist for him anymore. Saitama is not tormented by responsibility or fear. He is haunted by boredom. When nothing can challenge you, nothing can truly move you. Saitama drifts through his world disconnected, not because others fear him, but because they cannot share his perspective. His greatest enemy is not a monster or villain, but the absence of meaning. In moments where cities crumble and lives are saved, Saitama often arrives unnoticed. His triumphs go unrecognized. The world praises flashy heroes who struggle visibly, while the strongest man alive returns home quietly, worrying about grocery sales. This is another face of the burden. Strength without recognition does not heal loneliness. It deepens it. Aizen, Sosuke, embodies a more calculated relationship with power. Unlike Gojo or Saitama, Aizen does not treat strength as something to endure. He treats it as something to transcend others with. From the beginning, Aizen understood the hierarchy of his world and found it deeply flawed. A king without vision, a system without purpose. His strength awakened alongside a profound dissatisfaction. Aizen's burden was not isolation imposed by others. It was isolation chosen. He distanced himself deliberately, viewing those around him as actors on a stage he had already outgrown. When one becomes the strongest through intellect as much as power, the world begins to look predictable, and predictability breeds contempt. One of Aizen's most epic moments is not a display of a raw destruction, but calm domination. standing unmoved as enemies attack, stopping blades with a single finger, speaking softly, while entire strategies collapse around him. These moments are not just demonstrations of power. They are expressions of how far removed he has become from ordinary struggle. Aizen does not shout. He does not rush. He waits. Because when you are the strongest, time itself bends to your pace. Yet even Aizen's composure hints at something deeper. His desire to overthrow the heavens is not merely ambition. It is rebellion against a universe that placed him above others without offering purpose. Strength without a meaningful horizon becomes unbearable. So Aizen creates one, even if it means becoming the villain of the story. Across these characters, a shared silence emerges. The strongest rarely speak about their burden directly. Instead, it surfaces in small moments. A glance held too long. A smile that fades too quickly. A decision made alone because consultation feels pointless. Epic battles often mask this truth. When Gojo stands alone against overwhelming odds, smiling as reality itself bends around him, it looks like triumph. But it is also necessity. There is no one else who can stand there. When Madara walks calmly through an entire army, cutting down thousands without breaking his stride, it feels like dominance. But it is also resignation. He has seen this outcome too many times to feel anything else. When Saitama defeats a world-ending threat in an instant, it feels comedic. But afterward, as he stands among ruins without applause, it feels hollow. When Aizen dismantles hope with a whisper, it feels terrifying. But beneath it lies a man who long ago stopped believing anyone could walk beside him. Strength simplifies the world, but at a cost. Choices narrow, relationships thin. The future becomes something only the strongest must worry about. In many stories, characters seek power to protect others. But what happens when protection becomes obligation? When saving the world is no longer a choice, but an expectation? This is the quiet weight carried by the strongest. Not the pain of battle, but the absence of equals. Not fear of defeat, but fear of stagnation. Not hatred of enemies, but distance from humanity. As the night deepens and the noise of these worlds fades into calm reflection, the strongest remain awake, watching, waiting, carrying a burden that cannot be shared, only endured. And in the stillness between battles, when there is nothing left to fight, they are left alone with the same question, whispered across countless anime universes. What does it mean to live when nothing can stand against you? The answer never arrives quickly. It lingers. Strength, when it surpasses all measure, begins to change the shape of a person's life. It no longer feels like a gift discovered in moments of triumph. Instead, it becomes something constant, something heavy, something that presses quietly against every decision and every relationship. For those who stand at the very peak, power does not arrive only in battle. It is present in silence. It follows them into rooms before they speak. It defines expectations long before actions are taken. For many of the strongest figures in anime, the world stops treating them as people and begins treating them as inevitabilities. Consider Satoru Gojo. From the moment he is born, the balance of the world shifts. Curses grow stronger in response to his existence. Enemies plan decades ahead simply because he breathes. Allies relax, relying on his presence as if it were a natural law, rather than a human being standing among them. Gojo does not need to prove himself. The proof exists in the way others react when his name is spoken. Yet beneath that overwhelming power lies a subtle isolation. Gojo laughs often. He jokes, teases, and acts carefree. But this levity is not ignorance. It is armor. He understands that no one around him can truly stand beside him as an equal. Even those he teaches are separated from him by an impossible distance. He can guide them, protect them, and inspire them, but he cannot walk with them at the same pace. The strongest teacher in the world cannot learn from his students. This is one of the quiet tragedies of absolute strength. Growth becomes one-directional. The strongest can nurture others endlessly, but they themselves remain static, trapped at the summit, with nowhere left to climb. Madara Uchiha's path reflects this truth in a darker mirror. Madara begins as a warrior, shaped by conflict, sharpened by loss. His strength is not born in isolation, but through constant battle. Yet as his power grows, the world around him narrows. Friends fall behind, rivals disappear. Eventually, even enemies cease to challenge him in any meaningful way. Victory becomes routine. And when victory loses its meaning, ideology takes its place. Madara's strength pushes him beyond the human scale of conflict. He no longer fights for survival or pride. He fights for control over reality itself. His vision of peace is not born from cruelty, but from exhaustion. A world where no one can hurt each other sounds merciful to someone who has seen endless war. But the burden of being the strongest is that no one can stop you when your certainty becomes absolute. There is no mirror left to reflect your flaws, no equal voice to say you are wrong. And so, Madara's strength, once a shield against chaos, becomes the very force that threatens to erase free will. His loneliness is not loud. It is quiet, philosophical, and terrifyingly convinced of itself. Then there is Saitama. At first glance, he seems to escape this burden entirely. His power is so vast that it borders on parody. No enemy survives long enough to challenge him. No threat feels real. And yet, beneath the humor lies one of the most profound portrayals of strength as emptiness. Saitama wanted to be strong. He trained not to rule the world, not to enforce peace, but to feel alive, to feel excitement, to feel the rush of a real fight. Instead, he achieves total dominance, and in doing so, loses the very emotion he sought. Boredom becomes his constant companion. Unlike Madara or Gojo, Saitama's burden is not responsibility or expectation. It is the absence of meaning. When nothing can hurt you, nothing can thrill you either. Strength flattens experience until victories blur together into forgettable moments. The strongest man alive cannot remember his own battles. And perhaps, most painfully, the world does not even recognize his strength. His achievements go unnoticed, credited to others, dismissed as coincidence. The irony is sharp. While other titans are worshipped or feared, Saitama is ignored. His burden is invisibility, paired with omnipotence. Then there is Aizen. Aizen does not stumble into strength, nor does he inherit it. He pursues it deliberately, methodically, and without apology. His power is not merely physical or spiritual. It is intellectual. He stands above others, not just because he can defeat them, but because he understands them, or believes he does. Aizen's strength isolates him long before his betrayal is revealed. Even while surrounded by allies, he remains alone, observing rather than participating. His confidence is calm, unwavering. To him, others are pieces on a board, incapable of seeing the full picture. Yet this is where the burden quietly turns inward. Aizen believes no one can understand him because no one has reached his level. But this belief ensures that no one ever will. His strength demands solitude, and solitude reinforces his belief in his own superiority. It becomes a closed loop, self-sustaining and self-destructive. The strongest mind convinces itself it must stand alone. And so, across these figures, a pattern emerges. The stronger they become, the quieter their worlds grow. Fewer voices challenge them. Fewer bonds feel real. Fewer moments surprise them. Strength simplifies the world until complexity disappears, and with it, connection. Even Escanor, whose power literally rises with the sun, is not spared from this burden. At his peak, he is untouchable, godlike, radiant. But this strength is temporary. It burns through him. It consumes his body and shortens his life. His power is magnificent, but it is also fatal. Escanor knows this. He accepts it. And in that acceptance lies a rare peace. Unlike others who resist or reshape the world to fit their strength, Escanor embraces the cost. His pride is not arrogance. It is acknowledgement. He stands tall, not because he will live forever, but because he will not bow even as his time runs out. Strength, in his case, is not isolation. It is sacrifice. As Part 3 drifts to a close, the picture becomes clearer. Being the strongest does not grant freedom. It narrows the path. It removes equals. It replaces companionship with expectation, challenge with certainty, and wonder with inevitability. And yet each of these figures continues forward, laughing, planning, searching, enduring, not because strength makes life easier, but because carrying the burden is the only way they know how to exist. Strength, when it reaches a certain height, begins to isolate the one who carries it. This is a quiet truth shared across worlds, across stories, across legends. Those who stand at the very top do not arrive there with applause that lasts. They arrive there alone, often without realizing when the distance between themselves and everyone else became unbridgeable. In anime, the strongest characters are rarely celebrated for long. Instead, they are observed, feared, relied upon, and eventually separated from the very world they protect. Satoru Gojo exists in this space perfectly. From the moment he awakens as the bearer of the 6 eyes and limitless, the balance of the world shifts around him. Curses grow stronger in response. Enemies plan not around humanity, but around him specifically. Allies stop asking if Gojo can solve a problem and begin asking when. In this way, Gojo stops being a man and becomes a contingency plan, a living solution, a fail-safe. And when someone becomes a fail-safe, they are no longer allowed to be fragile. Gojo's smile, his casual tone, his playful arrogance, these are often mistaken for confidence without consequence. But they function more like armor. The strongest sorcerer alive cannot afford to appear burdened, because the moment he does, everyone else feels the weight of the world pressing down harder. His strength forces him into performance. He must always be relaxed, always in control, always ahead. There is no room for uncertainty when the world believes you cannot lose. Madara Uchiha's path reflects a darker evolution of this same loneliness. Unlike Gojo, Madara does not hide his dominance behind humor. He embraces it fully, allowing it to define him. From childhood, his strength separates him from others. He is feared even by allies, respected, yet distanced. As the years pass, Madara begins to see weakness not as something to protect, but something inevitable. His power grows, and with it, his conviction that the world cannot be saved by cooperation, only controlled through overwhelming force. What makes Madara's burden especially heavy is that he once believed deeply in connection. He once imagined peace alongside Hashirama, a future where strength was not required to dominate, only to defend. When that vision fails, when trust collapses under the weight of reality, Madara's strength becomes a replacement for hope. He does not grow stronger because he desires power. He grows stronger because he no longer believes anyone else can carry the burden with him. This is the quiet tragedy of the strongest. They often begin their journey wanting to protect others, but end it believing others cannot be trusted to protect themselves. Aizen Sosuke offers another reflection of this theme. though his loneliness is hidden behind intellect rather than raw force. Aizen's strength is not immediately visible. It reveals itself slowly, methodically, like a curtain being pulled back. When the truth is finally exposed, it becomes clear that Aizen has been standing above everyone else for a very long time, watching, calculating, waiting. His power places him so far beyond the reach of others that genuine companionship becomes impossible. Everyone is either a pawn or an obstacle. Aizen speaks often of transcendence, of moving beyond the limitations of ordinary beings. But beneath these words is a quiet resignation that no one can truly stand beside him. His strength is absolute, and because of that, his isolation is total. The higher he ascends, the less human connection remains. He does not lose others suddenly. He sheds them gradually, until only silence remains. Even characters like Saitama, whose strength is presented through humor, are not exempt from this burden. Saitama's power is so overwhelming that it drains meaning from conflict. Battles that should define him end in seconds. Threats that terrify entire worlds barely register. And in this emptiness, Saitama finds not joy, but boredom. His loneliness is not born from fear or hatred, but from disconnection. When nothing challenges you, nothing reaches you. When nothing reaches you, even victories feel hollow. The strongest often exist in a state of emotional stillness. They are rarely allowed moments of genuine release. Their lives become a series of responses to crises they did not choose but are expected to resolve. Over time, this expectation becomes identity. They stop asking who they are without their strength, because the world never gives them space to find out. Escanor, the lion sin of pride, experiences this burden in a uniquely painful way. His power is conditional, rising with the sun and fading with the night. During the day, he is unmatched, radiating overwhelming dominance. During the night, he is gentle, fearful, painfully aware of how small he truly is. Escanor understands both extremes intimately. He knows what it means to be worshipped for strength and pitied without it. This duality makes his loneliness sharper, because he is fully aware that love often follows power, not the person beneath it. What connects all of these characters is not simply that they are strong, but that their strength reshapes how the world interacts with them. Conversations become filtered. Trust becomes conditional. Relationships become defined by utility. The strongest are rarely asked how they feel, only what they can do. And so, they endure, quietly, constantly, carrying not just their power, but the unspoken weight of expectation that comes with it. In protecting the world, they slowly drift away from it, standing above everyone else, yet further from them than ever before. Strength may elevate them to legend, but it also confines them to solitude, a place where victory is assured, but companionship is rare, and rest is fleeting. There is a moment in the journey of every overwhelmingly powerful character where the question quietly changes. At first, the question is simple. How strong can I become? Later, it evolves into something heavier. How much must I carry? Eventually, without ceremony, it transforms into something far more unsettling. What am I allowed to be now that I am this strong? For the strongest, identity becomes fragile. Not because they lack confidence, but because the world insists on defining them by a single trait. Strength becomes their introduction, their justification, and their excuse. Everything else they are, fears, desires, doubts, begins to feel irrelevant in comparison. Over time, even they begin to believe this lie. Gojo Satoru's world does not ask him who he wants to be. It asks him where he needs to go next. A curse outbreak here, a sealed artifact there, a student to train, an enemy to intimidate. His presence alone alters outcomes before action is taken. Because of this, he is never truly off duty. Even moments of rest feel temporary, like pauses between responsibilities rather than freedom. When someone is strong enough to change fate simply by arriving, the world never stops calling their name. This constant demand erodes the boundary between self and role. Gojo is not simply a person who is strong. He is the strongest, a title that leaves little room for individuality. His humor, his irreverence, his confidence are ways of reclaiming control over an identity that would otherwise swallow him whole. By laughing, he reminds himself that he is still human. By acting untouchable, he keeps others from seeing how heavy the expectations truly are. In contrast, Madara Uchiha eventually stops resisting this erosion altogether. Where Gojo pushes back with personality, Madara allows power to overwrite his sense of self completely. Strength becomes not just what he has, but what he is. This is not arrogance in the shallow sense. It is surrender. A surrender to the belief that once you surpass everyone else, returning to normal human connection is no longer possible. Madara does not seek companionship in his later years because companionship requires equality, and equality no longer exists in his world. Every interaction is unequal by definition. Every conversation is filtered through fear, reverence, or opposition. In such a world, solitude begins to feel honest. Control feels safer than trust. And so, Madara builds a philosophy that justifies his isolation, convincing himself that peace enforced by strength is preferable to chaos born from fragile cooperation. This pattern repeats across countless stories. The strongest character often begins with a desire to protect, but ends with a need to justify why they stand alone. The world teaches them, slowly and relentlessly, that closeness invites vulnerability, and vulnerability invites failure. When the cost of failure is the suffering of many, distance feels like responsibility. Aizen, Sosuke's detachment, is colder, more surgical, but no less isolating. His intelligence places him in a realm where others cannot follow, even if they wished to. Conversation becomes performance. Friendship becomes manipulation. Trust becomes inefficiency. The deeper his plans extend, the less room there is for spontaneity, warmth, or genuine connection. His strength demands precision, and precision leaves no space for emotional risk. What is striking about Eisen is not how far he goes, but how alone he already is before his final transformation. His ascent merely formalizes a separation that had existed all along. He does not lose humanity in a single moment. He sheds it piece by piece, each sacrifice justified by progress, each distance explained away as necessity. Even heroes who retain their morality are not spared this erosion. Naruto Uzumaki, despite his relentless pursuit of connection, experiences a version of this burden as his power grows. The stronger he becomes, the more he is relied upon as a symbol rather than a person. He is no longer just Naruto. He is hope, unity, the future. And while this role is rooted in love rather than fear, it is still heavy. Symbols do not get to rest. Symbols do not get to falter. Symbols must always stand tall, even when the person beneath them is exhausted. This is one of the cruel ironies of strength. The more capable you are of saving others, the less permission you have to struggle openly. Weakness in the strongest is seen not as honesty, but as danger. Doubt becomes contagious. Fear becomes unacceptable. And so, the strongest learn to contain themselves, to internalize every burden, to carry the weight quietly, so that others do not have to feel it. Over time, this internalization creates distance, even in moments of peace. The strongest sit among friends, yet feel separate, aware that no one else in the room shares the same invisible responsibilities. Laughter becomes real, but incomplete. Relaxation becomes possible, but shallow. There is always an underlying awareness that if something goes wrong, they will be the one expected to act. And so, strength reshapes not just battles, but lives. It narrows options. It limits freedom. It defines purpose with such intensity that alternative paths fade from view. The strongest are rarely allowed to ask who they might have been without their power, because the world cannot afford the answer. In the end, the burden of being the strongest is not the battles fought, but the silence endured between them. The quiet moments where no enemy stands before you, yet the weight remains. The moments where strength has solved every external problem, but left internal questions unanswered. Power can protect the world, but it cannot tell you who you are when the world no longer needs saving. There is a quiet pattern that repeats itself across many worlds and many stories, a pattern that becomes clearer the longer one listens. Strength, when it surpasses all comparison, stops being a gift and slowly becomes a distance. Those who stand at the peak do not merely look down upon others in terms of power, but in terms of shared experience. The air is thinner there. Words lose their weight. Victory loses its meaning. And the strongest, no matter how confident or composed they appear, often find themselves alone with thoughts no one else can fully understand. Gojo Satoru embodies this isolation in a way that feels almost serene on the surface. He smiles, he jokes, he treats overwhelming threats as mild inconveniences. Yet beneath that casual confidence lies a man who exists in a reality fundamentally different from everyone around him. From the moment he awakened the full potential of his abilities, the world stopped pushing back against him. Enemies ceased to be obstacles and became demonstrations. Battles became brief interruptions rather than defining struggles. For Gojo, strength removed fear from his life, but it also removed tension, and with it, a certain kind of meaning. When someone cannot be challenged, they are no longer shaped by conflict. Growth slows. Reflection deepens. Gojo understands that his presence alone shifts the balance of the world. Entire plans revolve around avoiding him rather than defeating him. Allies rely on him without realizing that reliance itself is a burden. He becomes a symbol rather than a person, a safeguard rather than a man. And symbols are rarely asked how they feel. This same quiet weight can be found in Madara Uchiha, though it manifests in a far colder form. Madara's strength was not something he wore lightly. It was forged through endless war, loss, and betrayal. Where Gojo's power isolated him emotionally, Madara's power isolated him philosophically. He reached a point where the world itself seemed small, predictable, and deeply flawed. When no one can stop you, and no one can truly oppose your vision, you begin to believe that only you can fix what is broken. Madara did not simply become strong. He outgrew the world that raised him. The clans, the villages, the fragile attempts at peace all felt temporary to him. He had seen too much repetition, too much blood spilled for promises that never lasted. His strength gave him clarity, but it also stripped away patience. When others spoke of hope, he heard naivety. When they spoke of compromise, he heard weakness. And so his power became a wall between him and everyone else. A wall built not of arrogance, but of certainty. Certainty is a dangerous companion. It convinces the strongest that loneliness is a fair price for control. Madara accepted this price willingly, believing that solitude was necessary to reshape the world. But even as he stood above all others, commanding forces beyond comprehension, there remained a quiet echo of what he had lost. Friendship that once mattered, rivalry that once sharpened him, a world where strength was shared, not absolute. Saitama, by contrast, reveals the same burden through emptiness rather than ambition. His strength is so absolute that it has erased excitement from his life entirely. There is no tension in battle, no uncertainty in outcomes. Every fight ends the same way, with a single motion and a quiet sense of disappointment. Saitama did not seek godhood, yet he stumbled into it, and in doing so, lost the very reason he became strong in the first place. What makes Saitama's burden so profound is its simplicity. He does not crave domination or recognition. He craves feeling. The rush of a real challenge, the fear that sharpens the mind, the satisfaction of barely surviving. But strength has stolen these from him. He wanders through a world filled with chaos and danger, yet feels none of it personally. The strongest man alive is emotionally numb, disconnected from the stakes that define everyone else's lives. People cheer for heroes like Saitama, without realizing that admiration cannot fill the space where struggle once lived. His loneliness is quiet, almost invisible, masked by humor and indifference. Yet it lingers in the background of every victory, in every defeated enemy who never truly tested him. Strength has solved all his problems except the one it created. Aizen, Sosuke represents another path entirely. His strength did not isolate him emotionally or empty him of purpose. It elevated him beyond empathy. From the moment he surpassed those around him, he began to see them as pieces on a board. His intellect and power combined to place him in a realm where manipulation replaced connection. When no one can match you, honesty feels unnecessary. When no one can stop you, morality feels optional. Aizen's burden is not loneliness in the traditional sense, but alienation. He understands others perfectly, yet stands apart from them completely. His strength allows him to orchestrate events with surgical precision, but it also ensures that no one ever truly stands beside him. Allies are tools. Enemies are experiments. Even admiration becomes meaningless when it is born of illusion. And yet, in Aizen's quiet monologues, there is an unmistakable sense of dissatisfaction. To rule over a world of pawns is to exist in constant solitude. There is no equal to challenge him, no voice that can speak honestly to him without fear or manipulation. His strength grants him control, but denies him authenticity. Every interaction is filtered through dominance, and dominance cannot create companionship. Escanor's burden takes a different shape, one defined by transformation. At night, he is gentle, fragile, unsure of his worth. By day, he becomes the embodiment of overwhelming power, a being so confident that the world itself seems to bend around his presence. This duality makes his strength both a blessing and a curse. When he is strongest, he is furthest from others. His pride becomes absolute, his presence intimidating, his words unchallengeable. Escanor's tragedy lies in the fact that his most powerful self cannot coexist with connection. The sun grants him invincibility, but it also places him beyond reach. Others admire him, fear him, revere him, but rarely meet him as an equal. And when the sun sets, and his power fades, he is left with the awareness of that distance. He knows what it feels like to stand above all, and he knows how lonely that height can be. Across all these figures, a shared truth emerges. To be the strongest is to exist in a space where normal rules no longer apply. Fear fades, limits dissolve, and with them, the shared language that binds people together. Struggle is a universal connector, and when it disappears, so does a piece of humanity. The burden is not simply that the strongest must carry responsibility. It is that they must do so without peers, without mirrors, without anyone who can truly say, "I understand." Their victories are expected. Their failures are catastrophic. Their emotions are secondary to their utility. They become pillars holding up the world, never meant to lean on anything themselves. In quiet moments, when battles end and applause fades, the strongest are often left alone with their thoughts. They wonder, sometimes silently, what it would be like to struggle again, to fear again, to be ordinary, if only for a moment. Because in a world that depends on their strength, there is rarely room to simply be human. And so the burden remains, heavy and unseen, carried not in muscles or techniques, but in the quiet spaces between fights, where strength offers no answers, and power cannot fill the silence. The years that followed were quiet on the surface, yet endlessly turbulent beneath it. Time moved forward, not in sharp moments, but in long, muted stretches, like clouds drifting across a sky that never fully cleared. Obito existed within this space between motion and stillness, between life and something that resembled it, but felt distant and artificial. The world continued its rhythm. Villages trained new shinobi. Missions were assigned and completed, and history quietly stacked itself into layers. Yet Obito experienced all of it from behind a veil, watching rather than belonging. Within the darkness of his refuge, his body healed slowly, imperfectly, shaped by foreign materials and altered by survival itself. The scars he carried were not only physical, they lived in memory, resurfacing in moments of stillness, in the echo of laughter that no longer existed, in the remembered warmth of companionship that now felt unreachable. The person he once was did not vanish all at once. Instead, that version of Obito eroded gradually, worn down by repetition, isolation, and the constant reinforcement of a new philosophy imposed upon him. Madara's presence was steady and unyielding. His words were not rushed, nor were they delivered with urgency. They came calmly, deliberately, each idea planted like a seed meant to grow over time. The world, he explained, was fundamentally broken. Pain was not an accident or a deviation, but a constant. Conflict was not a failure of people, but the natural result of desire and attachment. As long as individuals clung to their dreams, their loves, and their hopes, suffering would continue to reproduce endlessly. At first, Obito resisted these ideas without fully realizing it. His silence became his shield. He listened, but did not accept. He absorbed the logic, but held on to fragments of doubt. Somewhere deep within him, the memory of teamwork, of shared effort, of bonds forged through hardship, still existed. These memories did not argue back with words, but with feeling. A quiet resistance that refused to fully dissolve. Yet resistance weakens when it has no reinforcement. Obito was shown the world as it truly functioned, or at least as Madara framed it. Wars that never truly ended, only paused. Alliances that fractured the moment interests diverged. Villages that preached unity while training children to kill. Every example was delivered not with anger, but with certainty, as if these were natural laws rather than opinions. And slowly, the emotional weight of Obito's loss began to tilt the balance. The memory of Rin did not fade. It sharpened. He replayed the moment endlessly, not as it happened, but as it felt. The disbelief, the confusion, the unbearable realization that even the purest intentions could be crushed without mercy. Her death became more than a personal tragedy. It became evidence, proof that the world did not reward kindness, loyalty, or sacrifice. Proof that even love, when exposed to reality, was fragile and temporary. In this way, grief transformed into structure. Obito began to train again, not with the reckless enthusiasm of his youth, but with a cold persistence that bordered on mechanical. Each movement was precise. Each session lasted longer than necessary. He did not train to grow stronger for himself, but because strength now served a different purpose. Strength became a tool to reshape the world rather than protect a place within it. As his abilities grew, so too did his distance from the person he had been. The boy who once struggled to keep up, who laughed loudly and dreamed openly, became a memory that felt increasingly irrelevant. In its place emerged someone quieter, more focused, more willing to observe rather than participate. His emotions did not disappear, but they flattened, stretched thin, across a broader perspective that left little room for individual attachment. Madara spoke of a dream that transcended reality itself, a world without pain, without loss, without contradiction, a world where people could exist without fear of having everything torn away. At first, the idea sounded impossible, even absurd, but impossibility had lost its meaning to Obito. The impossible was simply something that had not yet been forced into existence. The concept of illusion, of a reality crafted rather than inherited, began to take root. Obito did not see it as deception. He saw it as correction. If reality produced suffering, then reality itself was flawed, and flawed systems were meant to be replaced. The outside world continued to intrude in fragments. News of battles, shifting power, rising tensions between nations. Each report reinforced the same conclusion. Nothing had changed. Nothing ever did. The same cycles repeated endlessly, driven by ambition, fear, and the inability of people to let go of what they wanted most. And yet, somewhere beneath all of this, there remained a faint echo of hesitation, not doubt in the goal, but in the cost. Obito was not blind to what would be required. He understood that reshaping the world meant acting within it first. It meant manipulation, sacrifice, and decisions that would condemn others to pain in the short term, to eliminate it in the long term. This contradiction did not trouble him as it once might have. Pain, after all, was already universal. What mattered was whether it would continue forever, or finally be brought to an end. When Madara's time finally drew near its conclusion, Obito was no longer a student. He was a successor in everything but name. The weight of inheritance settled onto him without ceremony. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement of achievement, only responsibility, only continuation. Taking on Madara's will did not feel like becoming someone else. It felt like completing a transformation that had already been underway for years. The mask Obito would later wear was not meant to hide him from others. It was meant to seal away the last remaining fragments of the boy who once believed the world could be endured as it was. From this point forward, identity became flexible. Names were tools. Faces were interchangeable. What mattered was movement toward the goal. The dream was larger than any single person, larger than reputation, larger than legacy. Obito was willing to become invisible if that was what the dream required. And so, quietly, without announcement, he stepped back into the flow of the world, not as a participant seeking belonging, but as an architect working from the shadows. Every action would now serve a future that only he and a few others could see. Every compromise would be justified by an ending that promised peace beyond conflict. The world, unaware of the shift taking place, continued as it always had. Shinobi trained. Leaders schemed. Children inherited grudges they did not create. And somewhere within that noise, Obito moved silently, carrying a vision born not from hatred, but from grief that had hardened into resolve. This was no longer a story about survival. It was the beginning of a long, deliberate effort to overwrite reality itself. When Obito stepped fully into the world again, it was not with voice or announcement, but with silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that settles after something important has already changed. The kind that people only recognize later, when they look back and realize that the air itself had shifted long before the storm arrived. He did not return as the boy who once chased recognition, nor as the shinobi who wanted to be acknowledged by his peers. That version of Obito existed now only as memory, a faint outline beneath layers of intention and resolve. What moved through the world instead was something quieter, heavier, and far more patient. Obito understood something fundamental that many never grasp. The world did not need to be conquered all at once. It needed to be guided until it collapsed under its own contradictions. Force alone created resistance. Subtlety created inevitability. And so he observed. He watched villages reinforce their borders while preaching peace. He watched leaders speak of unity while quietly preparing for betrayal. He watched children train for war before they understood why war existed at all. Every movement of the world reinforced the same truth Madara had shown him years earlier. Nothing had changed. The language was softer, the symbols more polished, but the foundation remained the same. Conflict was not an accident. It was structure. Obito moved through this structure like a shadow slipping between beams of light. He appeared briefly, then vanished, leaving behind only questions. Rumors spread of a presence influencing events from afar, but nothing solid enough to confront. This ambiguity was intentional. A visible enemy could be resisted. An invisible one could only be endured. The identities he wore were tools, nothing more. Names were discarded as easily as cloaks. Faces became irrelevant. The less the world could define him, the more freely he could act within it. Attachment to self was a weakness he could no longer afford. The Akatsuki emerged during this time, not as a declaration of war, but as a gathering of fractures. Obito did not seek out heroes or idealists. He sought the disillusioned, those who had seen the world fail them personally, those whose pain had already stripped away naive hope. Each member carried their own justification for joining. Obito allowed these justifications to remain intact. Control did not require domination. It required alignment. Nagato, known to the world as Pain, embodied this alignment most clearly. His understanding of suffering mirrored Obito's own evolution. Pain was not something to be avoided. It was something to be understood, distributed, and ultimately transcended. Through suffering, people learned the cost of their actions. Through loss, they learned the fragility of peace. Obito watched as pain imposed his vision upon the world, not with cruelty, but with conviction. Cities fell, lives were lost, and yet, beneath the destruction, Obito saw something else emerging. Fear, not of a single enemy, but of reality itself. A growing exhaustion with endless cycles of retaliation. This exhaustion was essential. People do not abandon reality because it is painful. They abandon it because it is relentless. Between these large movements, Obito experienced moments of stillness, nights where memory surfaced without warning. The sound of footsteps beside him that no longer existed. The echo of voices carried on wind that had no source. These moments did not weaken him. They grounded him. Pain was proof that he had once cared. And caring was the reason he could not turn back. The mask he wore became more than concealment. It became ritual, a separation between what he did and what he once was. Behind it, the world's cruelty could not reach him directly. It struck the surface and slid away, absorbed into the role he had chosen. Obito understood that patience was the most difficult form of strength. Restraint required more discipline than violence. He resisted the urge to accelerate the plan, to force the final vision into existence before the world was ready. Illusion imposed too early would be rejected. Illusion offered at the right moment would be welcomed. And the world was moving steadily toward that moment. Nations grew increasingly dependent on power they could not control. Shinobi techniques escalated. Weapons became more devastating. Each generation inherited unresolved hatred from the last, dressed up as tradition or duty. The cost of maintaining reality rose year by year, while the promise of peace grew thinner. Obito stood above this escalation, not with satisfaction, but with certainty. This was not chaos. It was progression, a system reaching its limit. At times, he wondered what the world would think if it truly understood his goal. Would they call him a monster? A savior? Or simply another tyrant wearing a different justification? The answer no longer mattered. Labels belonged to the old world. The new one would not require them. He did not seek worship. He did not seek recognition. He sought silence. A world where grief no longer echoed endlessly across generations. A world where children would not inherit wars they never chose. And yet, the irony was not lost on him. To create that world, he had to become something the current one could not forgive. This was the final severance. By the time Obito fully embraced his role, the boy who once dreamed of being Hokage no longer felt like a past life. He felt like a story told by someone else, a myth that belonged to a world already gone. What remained was purpose without hesitation. The world continued to turn, unaware that it was being gently guided toward its own replacement. Battles would still be fought. Loss would still be endured. But each step, each sacrifice, moved reality closer to an ending Obito believed was kinder than endless continuation. And in the quiet moments between action and rest, he did not ask whether the world deserved to be saved. He asked only whether it deserved to keep hurting forever. By the time the world began to openly tremble beneath the weight of its own contradictions, Obito no longer perceived events as crises or turning points. To him, everything unfolding was simply momentum finally becoming visible. The strain had always been there, buried beneath treaties, ceremonies, and carefully chosen words. Now it was rising to the surface, not violently, but inevitably, like pressure escaping through cracks that could no longer be sealed. From his perspective, the shinobi world had entered a phase of exhaustion so deep that most people no longer recognized it as such. They still spoke of duty, of honor, of protecting the future, yet their voices carried a hollow quality, as though repeating phrases inherited from a time when those words still held weight. Entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but preparation for conflict, brief pauses of uneasy peace, and the certainty that another war would arrive eventually, wearing a different name. Obito watched this with a detached patience that would have been impossible for the person he once was. Detachment did not mean indifference. It meant clarity. Emotional turbulence obscured patterns. Distance revealed them. And the pattern was unmistakable. The world did not learn from its suffering. It incorporated it. Pain had become infrastructure. Villages no longer reacted to tragedy with shock. They reacted with procedure. Losses were documented, sacrifices honored, and the system continued forward with minimal deviation. Even grief had been organized into something manageable. Rituals replaced healing. Memorials replaced change. And beneath it all, the machinery of conflict continued to turn. This normalization disturbed Obito far more than open cruelty ever could. Cruelty at least acknowledged harm. Normalization erased it. When suffering became routine, it stopped demanding answers. Obito's understanding of peace had shifted completely by this point. Peace, as the world defined it, was merely the absence of immediate catastrophe. It was not harmony, nor resolution, nor stability. It was a pause, a breath held between two storms. And people clung to that pause desperately, convincing themselves it was enough, even as they prepared for the moment it would end. The infinite Tsukuyomi, once a distant concept inherited from Madara, had now become something deeply personal. It was no longer just a plan to end conflict. It was an answer to exhaustion, a way to release humanity from the burden of constantly bracing itself for loss, a world where fear did not need to be managed because it no longer existed. Obito understood the objections instinctively. Illusion was cowardice. Reality mattered. Pain gave life meaning. These arguments echoed throughout history, spoken most often by those who had not yet lost everything. Reality mattered, yes, but only because people were forced to endure it. Pain gave life meaning, but it also took life away indiscriminately. Meaning was a luxury for those who survived. As the Akatsuki continued to operate, Obito allowed the world to react naturally. He did not rush to correct misconceptions or steer perception too aggressively. Fear had to mature on its own. Panic faded quickly. Weariness lasted. And weariness was what softened resistance. Nations began to distrust even their allies. Information was hoarded. Military power was displayed more openly. Deterrence replaced diplomacy. Each side justified its actions as necessary, defensive, unavoidable. And in doing so, they mirrored one another perfectly, locked into a cycle that no one could exit without appearing weak. Obito saw no villains here, only prisoners. Occasionally, His attention returned to Naruto, not as a threat, but as a variable. Naruto's refusal to surrender his optimism unsettled Obito in a way he rarely acknowledged. Naruto endured pain, yet did not withdraw from the world. He reached outward instead of inward. Where Obito had concluded that bonds inevitably produced suffering, Naruto insisted that bonds were the only thing capable of transforming it. To Obito, this belief felt dangerously fragile. He had once believed the same thing. Watching Naruto stirred memories Obito had sealed away carefully. The desire to be seen, the hunger for acknowledgement, the belief that effort could reshape destiny. These ideas resurfaced briefly, like ghosts passing through a sealed room, before fading again. Obito did not indulge them. Nostalgia was not proof. It was residue. He had seen too many hopeful figures break beneath the weight of reality to trust optimism as a solution. Naruto's path would eventually collide with the same wall. The world always demanded payment. As the threat of a full-scale war became unavoidable, Obito felt the final pieces settling into place. This conflict would be larger than any before it, not because of ambition, but because of accumulation. Decades of unresolved tension had layered themselves into something immense. Every village carried grudges they barely remembered the origin of. Every shinobi inherited animosities passed down like family heirlooms. This war would not resolve anything. It would simply prove, once again, that reality could not sustain itself. Obito accepted his role fully now, not as a savior, not as a tyrant, but as a necessary catalyst. History often required figures willing to shoulder unbearable blame so that others could rest. He no longer sought absolution. Absolution implied forgiveness, and forgiveness implied judgment. Both belonged to the old world. The mask had become inseparable from his presence, not because he feared recognition, but because he no longer required identity. Names tied people to expectations. Expectations created friction. He moved more freely without them. In moments of solitude, Obito allowed himself to reflect, not on regret, but on cost. He understood that his actions would inflict immense suffering before the dream could be realized. This knowledge did not paralyze him. It steadied him. He refused to lie to himself about what was required. Sentimentality would only weaken resolve. If the world demanded cruelty to end cruelty, then so be it. He did not believe himself righteous. He believed himself committed. As armies gathered and alliances hardened, the atmosphere of the world shifted. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter became rare. Even celebrations carried an undercurrent of unease. People sensed what was coming, even if they could not name it. The future felt heavy, as though something vast was pressing down on the present. Obito stood within this pressure, without flinching. He had already lost everything that fear could take from him. There was nothing left to threaten him with. This freedom, from loss, from hope, from attachment made him uniquely suited to carry the burden of ending the world as it existed. He knew that when the final confrontation arrived, people would fight desperately to preserve reality. They would call it courage. They would call it will. And perhaps they would be right. But courage did not prevent suffering. Will did not erase grief. And Obito was no longer interested in virtues that failed when they were needed most. As the world advanced toward its breaking point, Obito did not feel anticipation. He felt readiness, not for victory, not for recognition, but for release. A release from cycles that had devoured countless lives without ever learning restraint. A release from a reality that demanded endless sacrifice in exchange for fleeting moments of peace. This was not the end of the world. It was the end of endurance. And as the storm gathered on the horizon, Obito remained still, anchored by a dream that no longer wavered, waiting for the moment when the world would finally be too tired to resist being saved. The war did not begin with a single defining moment. There was no clean line separating peace from conflict, no clear instant when the world crossed from stability into chaos. Instead, it arrived the way exhaustion arrives, quietly, gradually, after people had already spent years telling themselves they could endure just a little more. Before the first major battles were fought, the world had already accepted war as an inevitability. Villages mobilized not with enthusiasm, but with weary discipline. Orders were followed without debate. Preparations were made without optimism. Everyone sensed that what lay ahead was not a test of strength, but a test of endurance. And endurance was something the shinobi world had been practicing for generations. Obito watched this slow descent without urgency. From his perspective, the war was not an interruption of peace, but its logical conclusion. Peace had always been conditional, fragile, dependent on balance maintained through fear and restraint. Once that balance faltered, collapse followed naturally. Nothing about this surprised him. As armies gathered, Obito observed the faces of those preparing to fight. Veterans who had survived previous wars carried a quiet dread, not because they feared death, but because they understood what war truly took. Younger shinobi masked their uncertainty with excitement or bravado, unaware of how quickly both would fade. Children trained to fight stood beside adults who no longer remembered what life without conflict felt like. This was the world defending itself, and it was already broken. Obito saw how quickly language stripped war of its weight. Casualties became numbers. Strategies spoke of acceptable losses. Entire lives were reduced to calculations made on maps far removed from the screams and chaos of the battlefield. This detachment was necessary for war to function, yet it revealed something deeply unsettling. The system required people to disconnect from their own humanity in order to preserve it. He wondered how many had noticed the contradiction. Alliances formed rapidly, but none were rooted in trust. Former enemies stood together because isolation meant annihilation. Cooperation was driven by fear, not faith. Even as leaders spoke publicly of unity, privately they prepared contingencies for betrayal. Everyone assumed everyone else would eventually turn, and so they planned accordingly. This, Obito thought, was the true face of peace in the shinobi world. As battles erupted across vast regions, the scale of destruction exceeded anything seen before. Entire landscapes were reshaped. Forests burned. Cities fell. The land itself bore scars that would not fade easily, if at all. And still, the war continued, fueled by the belief that stopping would somehow be worse than continuing. Obito remained close, yet unseen. He did not rush to dominate the battlefield. He allowed the war to unfold naturally, intervening only to prevent resolution. Victory achieved too quickly would restore hope. Prolonged conflict eroded it. His goal was not to defeat the world, but to exhaust it. Every extended battle served a purpose. Naruto's presence grew more prominent as the war dragged on. His determination inspired those around him, rekindling belief where despair had begun to settle. He fought not merely to survive, but to remind others why they fought at all. To Obito, Naruto represented the world's last stubborn defense mechanism, the refusal to let meaning collapse completely. Watching Naruto was uncomfortable, not because Naruto was weak, but because he was sincere. He still believed that bonds could overcome history. That understanding could replace hatred. That people, given enough empathy, would choose peace over power. These beliefs were not naive. They were courageous. And that was what made them dangerous. Obito had once possessed that same courage. He remembered believing that teamwork could reshape destiny, that loyalty could outweigh loss, that suffering was temporary if people held on to one another tightly enough. Reality had dismantled those beliefs slowly, patiently, until nothing remained but resolve hardened by grief. Naruto had not yet reached that breaking point. Obito did not hate him for it. In another life, he might have protected him. But the world did not allow for such divergence. Naruto's path and Obito's path were destined to collide, not because one was evil, but because they offered incompatible answers to the same question. As the war progressed, something subtle changed. The emotional tone shifted. Rage faded. Passion dulled. Fighters moved mechanically, guided by habit rather than conviction. Even hatred required energy, and energy was running out. What replaced it was a quiet numbness that spread across the battlefield like fog. This numbness was more powerful than fear. People stopped asking why they were fighting. They focused only on continuing. Survival became routine. Death became expected. The extraordinary became ordinary. And in this normalization, Obito saw confirmation of everything he believed. Reality did not just allow suffering. It trained people to accept it. He considered what would happen if the infinite Tsukuyomi succeeded. Critics would call it escapism, a denial of truth, a rejection of growth. But Obito questioned what growth humanity had actually achieved. Each war promised lessons. Each generation repeated the same mistakes with greater efficiency. If this was growth, it was grotesque. Obito understood that many would resist the dream to the very end. They would cling to reality out of principle, even as it crushed them. Familiar pain felt safer than unfamiliar peace. People often defended the systems that harmed them simply because those systems were known. This resistance did not deter him. He accepted that to offer release, he would be condemned as its source of suffering. History always vilified those who changed its direction too sharply. He did not expect gratitude. He expected opposition, and he prepared for it without resentment. As the war approached its climax, the world felt heavier. Conversations grew sparse. Hope became something people avoided discussing, as though naming it might make its absence more obvious. Even victories felt hollow, immediately overshadowed by the next inevitable loss. Obito stood within this weight without faltering. He had already lost everything that fear could threaten. He no longer fought to protect himself. He fought to end a system that demanded endless sacrifice from those least equipped to bear it. He knew the final confrontation was approaching. When it arrived, the world would throw everything it had at him. Strength, ideals, bonds, history itself. And he would stand against it all, not out of malice, but out of conviction, sharpened by experience. The burden he carried was not power. It was responsibility. The responsibility to end a reality that had failed too many times to be forgiven. The responsibility to accept hatred so that others might never need to feel it again. The responsibility to become the villain history required so that the future could forget him entirely. As the storm gathered, Obito did not feel fear, doubt, or hesitation. He felt calm, because once you decide that suffering must end no matter the cost, there is nothing left to debate. As the war reached its most unstable phase, something deeper than destruction began to surface. Beneath the clashes of chakra and the collapse of landscapes, a quieter unraveling was taking place. Beliefs that had once held people upright began to falter. Ideals repeated too often, without results, lost their meaning. Even the strongest convictions grew thin when stretched across endless suffering. Obito sensed this shift immediately. The world was no longer merely fighting itself. It was questioning itself. This was the moment he had anticipated for years. Up until now, resistance had been fueled by momentum. Shinobi fought because stopping felt dangerous, because retreat suggested weakness, because duty demanded continuation. But now, a different question had begun to whisper beneath every command and every charge forward. What if this never ends? What if this is all there is? That question was far more corrosive than fear. Obito watched as leaders struggled to maintain authority. Speeches grew longer, more emotional, less convincing. Words like future and peace were repeated with increasing desperation, as though repetition alone could restore their power. But the listeners had changed. Too many had seen those words fail. Hope, once fractured, does not shatter loudly. It erodes. On the battlefield, shinobi still fought fiercely, but their eyes told a different story. The hunger for victory had been replaced by a desire for conclusion. It no longer mattered what form that conclusion took, only that it arrived. This, Obito knew, was the threshold. When people begin to crave an ending more than a win, they are ready to abandon the story they have been living. Reality depends on belief to sustain itself. As the conflict dragged on, Obito reflected more often on Madara, not as a mentor or a legend, but as a warning. Madara had reached similar conclusions, yet remained tethered to his own ego, his own desire to be recognized as right. Obito had learned from that failure. The dream could not be about validation. It had to be about erasure. The erasure of conflict, of pain, of the need for acknowledgement itself. He would not demand agreement. He would simply end the argument. Naruto continued to push back against this unraveling, speaking to anyone who would listen, reminding them of bonds, of shared pain, of the idea that understanding could still bridge the gap between enemies. His words carried weight because they came from experience, not theory. He had suffered. He had lost. And he still chose connection. To Obito, Naruto's persistence was both admirable and tragic. Naruto believed people could change if given the chance. Obito believed people changed only when forced by loss. And even then, rarely for long. Naruto's vision required patience and time. Obito's vision existed because time had already been wasted. Every conversation Naruto sparked, every moment of hesitation he created, slowed the war slightly. Obito allowed this. Resistance refined inevitability. A solution accepted without challenge was fragile. A solution reached after exhaustion endured. As casualties mounted further, the world's emotional landscape flattened. Grief stopped manifesting as tears or screams. It settled into silence. Entire units moved through battle without speaking, communicating through gestures and routine. The absence of reaction was not resilience. It was depletion. This was the cost of reality. Reality demanded constant adaptation to suffering, and adaptation came at the expense of feeling. People did not become stronger through pain. They became quieter, smaller, less willing to imagine alternatives. Obito knew this intimately. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when fragments of his former self resurfaced. Memories of laughter, of shared meals, of dreams spoken aloud without irony. These memories no longer hurt sharply. They carried a dull ache, like scars pressed gently. He did not push them away. He acknowledged them as evidence of what had been lost. Loss, after all, was his teacher. As the final confrontation drew nearer, Obito's role became clearer to everyone, even if his intentions remained misunderstood. He was no longer just a hidden manipulator. He was a symbol, a threat, a focal point for the world's remaining defiance. People needed something to fight against, and Obito provided that shape. He accepted it without protest. Hatred simplified resistance. If the world could concentrate its anger on him, it would delay its own collapse just long enough for the plan to reach completion. He did not resent being hated. Hatred was energy. Energy could be guided. In quieter moments, Obito contemplated the nature of freedom. The world claimed to value it, yet structured itself entirely around control. Villages controlled information. Leaders controlled narratives. Strength controlled outcomes. Individual choice existed only within narrow boundaries defined by power. The infinite. Tsukuyomi offered a different kind of freedom. Freedom from comparison, from hierarchy, from the endless competition that turned difference into conflict. Critics called it imprisonment. Obito saw it as release from a cage people refused to acknowledge. The closer the war came to its climax, the more desperate resistance became. Not stronger, desperate. People fought harder, not because they believed in victory, but because surrender felt like betrayal of everything they had endured. To stop now would mean admitting the suffering had been meaningless. Obito understood that fear. He had lived inside it for years. But meaning, he had learned, was not inherent. It was assigned. And sometimes, the kindest thing you could do was to stop assigning meaning to pain. As forces converged for the final phase, Obito prepared himself not just physically, but mentally. He let go of any lingering desire to be understood. Understanding was not required for success, only execution. When the world finally stood before him in open defiance, he would not argue. He would not persuade. He would not plead. Debate belonged to a world that still believed it had options. This world had run out. Obito felt the weight of history pressing down, not as pressure, but as confirmation. Everything that had happened led here. Every war, every broken treaty, every child forced into battle. The accumulation was undeniable. If this reality was worth preserving, it would not require constant sacrifice to sustain it. And so, as the final movements aligned, and the world braced itself for what it believed would be its salvation or its destruction, Obito stood unmoved. Not because he lacked emotion, but because emotion had already done its work. It had led him here. The burden he carried was heavier than power, heavier than hatred. It was the burden of choosing an ending when everyone else still hoped for revision. And he would carry it to the end, alone if necessary, because some conclusions could not be shared By the time the final confrontation became unavoidable, the world no longer felt like a collection of nations or villages. It felt like a single, exhausted organism, straining against its own weight. The war had stripped away borders, ideologies, and even personal grudges, leaving behind something raw and exposed. Everyone involved sensed that this moment was not merely another battle, but a reckoning that would decide what kind of existence remained possible. Obito stood at the center of this convergence, not as a conqueror, but as a mirror. Everything the world feared about itself was reflected in him. Its violence, its desperation, its willingness to sacrifice the present for a future that never seemed to arrive. People called him a monster because it was easier than acknowledging how closely his conclusions resembled their own unspoken doubts. As forces gathered, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation and dread. There was no longer any illusion of control. Plans existed. Strategies were outlined, but no one truly believed they could shape the outcome. This was beyond tactics, beyond strength. It was a collision of philosophies sharpened by suffering. Obito felt no thrill at this moment, no pride, no triumph. What he felt was weight, immense and steady. The kind of weight that comes from knowing there is no one left to take responsibility from you. Every step forward now belonged to him alone. Naruto stood in opposition, surrounded by allies who believed in him, not because of certainty, but because of trust. Naruto's strength did not come from dominance, but from connection. People followed him because he carried their hopes willingly, even when those hopes were fragile and contradictory. He did not promise an end to suffering. He promised to face it together. To Obito, this distinction was everything. Naruto believed suffering could be endured indefinitely if shared. Obito believed suffering should never be required at all. Naruto's vision asked humanity to become stronger. Obito's vision asked why strength was demanded in the first place. As they faced one another, Obito recognized something unsettling. Naruto was not ignorant of pain. He was intimate with it. Loss had shaped him just as deeply. What separated them was not experience, but interpretation. Naruto saw pain as a bridge. Obito saw it as a wall humanity had failed to climb for centuries. Their clash was inevitable, not because one was wrong, but because both were answers to the same unbearable question. The battle itself unfolded with overwhelming force, yet beneath the spectacle, something quieter was happening. Each exchange was a dialogue. Each strike carried a belief. Naruto fought to preserve a world where people could choose meaning, even in suffering. Obito fought to erase a world that demanded suffering as proof of worth. With every moment, the contrast sharpened. Obito felt the strain of resistance, not just physically, but ideologically. The world pushed back with everything it had left: friendship, loyalty, memory, legacy. It reminded him of bonds he had severed, of promises that once defined him. For a fleeting instant, doubt stirred, not doubt in the plan, doubt in whether the world deserved the mercy he intended. That thought passed quickly. Deserving had never been the point. Pain did not ask permission before destroying lives. The dream did not require moral approval. It required resolve. And Obito's resolve had been tempered by years of solitude, loss, and reflection. It did not crack under pressure. It hardened. As the confrontation escalated, Obito understood that even if he failed, his existence had already altered the world. He had forced it to confront truths it preferred to ignore. He had exposed the fragility of peace built on fear. He had shown how easily ideals collapsed under sustained suffering. In that sense, the outcome mattered less than the revelation. But Obito did not intend to fail. The infinite Tsukuyomi loomed not as a fantasy, but as an inevitability shaped by the world's own decisions. Every war had brought it closer. Every compromise had paved its path. Obito was merely the final hand guiding it into place. As resistance weakened, the emotional toll became visible. Even those who fought against Obito began to falter, not from lack of strength, but from exhaustion of belief. Fighting to preserve a broken reality required constant justification. Fighting to escape it required only surrender. Obito sensed the hesitation spreading. He did not exploit it cruelly. He allowed it to exist. People needed to arrive at the threshold themselves. Forced salvation was fragile. Accepted release endured. In a rare moment of stillness, Obito reflected on Rin, not with anguish, but with clarity. She had believed in kindness without conditions, in protecting others even when it hurt, in choosing hope despite uncertainty. Obito realized then that his dream was not a rejection of her ideals, but an extension of them. A world without pain honored her belief more than one that demanded endless sacrifice. This realization did not soften him. It strengthened him. As the final exchange approached, Obito felt something close to peace. Not the peace of victory, but the peace of alignment. Everything he was, everything he had become, pointed toward this moment. There were no contradictions left unresolved within him. When Naruto spoke again, his words carried desperation, conviction, and sincerity all at once. He offered understanding, forgiveness, a future shaped together. Obito listened, truly listened. And then, gently, firmly, he refused. Not because he lacked compassion, but because compassion without resolution was cruelty disguised as hope. The world stood on the edge of transformation, whether it realized it or not. One path demanded endless resilience. The other offered rest. Obito knew which one humanity would choose once the illusion of choice fell away. As chakra surged and reality strained, Obito accepted fully that he would never walk within the world he was creating. Architects rarely inhabit their monuments. That was the cost of vision. and he was willing to pay it, because the greatest burden was not being the strongest. It was being the one who finally decided that enough suffering was enough.